What disturbs people's minds is not events themselves, but the judgments they form about them. This profound quote comes from none other than Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher who ruled from 161 to 180 AD. Despite holding immense power and wealth, Marcus found solace not in material pleasures, but in the ancient teachings of Stoicism. For Marcus, the path to inner peace was through rigorous self-discipline, rational thinking, and acceptance of what lies beyond our control. And one of his key practices was a form of philosophical meditation. So join me on this journey into the mind of this remarkable historical figure. In this immersive experience, we'll explore the origins and core principles of the Stoic meditation techniques advocated by Marcus Aurelius himself. You'll gain insights into how he used practices like negative visualization, nightly self-reflection, and adopting a cosmic perspective to maintain tranquility and virtue amidst the turbulent demands of ruling an empire. But this is not just a passive viewing experience. I invite you, the audience, to actively participate by sharing your own perspectives and reflections on the profound wisdom Marcus Aurelius left behind in his seminal work, Meditations. Stay with us until the end, as this journey promises not just knowledge, but an opportunity for your own deep self-exploration and potential transformation. So let's begin by taking a look at who Marcus Aurelius was and why his philosophical writings have stood the test of time. Marcus Aurelius was born in 121 AD into a life of privilege as a member of the Roman imperial family. Intellectually gifted from a young age, he received an excellent education strongly influenced by Stoic philosophy. The ancient Stoics believed that the path to happiness and well-being came through living an ethical life, based on virtue, reason, and acceptance of the things outside our control. This philosophy emerged from the teachings of the Greek philosopher Zeno of Citium in the 3rd century BC. Central to Stoic beliefs was the idea that many of life's troubles stem from our own flawed judgments and inability to distinguish between what we can and cannot control. The Stoics taught that by focusing only on that which is within our personal power, our own thoughts, judgments, and actions, we can achieve a state of inner peace and freedom from suffering. From a young age, Marcus Aurelius was instilled with these Stoic principles by a series of influential tutors and philosophers. He took to heart the Stoic directive of living a life of virtue, duty, humility, self-discipline, and acceptance of the natural, rational order of the universe. When Aurelius unexpectedly became emperor in 161 AD, at the age of 40, he had a reputation for austerity and seriousness of mind. His classical biographers praised him for shunning the lavish excesses typical of imperial life and devoting himself fully to the teachings of philosophy. However, Aurelius's 19-year reign as emperor was anything but peaceful or easy. He faced constant military campaigns against Germanic tribes along the empire's borders. A devastating pandemic known as the Antonine Plague swept across Rome, killing millions. Aurelius even had to put down an attempted coup led by his closest military advisor and brother-in-law. Amidst this turbulent backdrop of wars, civic unrest, disease, and political intrigue, the philosopher King Aurelius turned to the solace and guidance of Stoic meditation techniques. He channeled his personal reflections and spiritual exercises into a work titled Meditations, a timeless classic providing an intimate look into one man's philosophical journey. It's important to note that the Meditations were never intended as a formal, philosophical treatise, but rather a private notebook of thoughts, observations, and self-reminders on living a virtuous life. Aurelius himself likely never envisioned these writings being published and circulated widely. Yet it is precisely this quality of the Meditations as a first-hand account, straight from the pen of the philosopher himself, that gives the work such resonance and lasting impact even today. Through the passages of the Meditations, we gain a candid view into the inner mental landscape of one of history's most powerful figures, as he continuously grappled with the eternal quest to lead a meaningful, principled existence in the face of life's harsh realities and universal struggles like anger, grief, injustice, and mortality. At its core, Stoicism aimed to free the practitioner from the attachments, fears, and false value judgments that generate disturbing emotions and suffering. And Aurelius prescribed several key meditation techniques drawn from Stoic thought as therapeutic tools to achieve this inner liberation. One of the most famous of these Stoic practices was called negative visualization. This involved vividly contemplating the impermanence of things we feel attached to. Our possessions, relationships, status, and even our very existence itself. The goal was to gain a greater sense of appreciation and non-attachment to the people and objects around us by meditating on the prospect of their loss. As Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, "Consider that everything is opinion, and opinion is in thy power. Take away then, when thou choosest, thy opinion, and like a mariner, who has doubled the promontory, thou wilt find calm, everything stable, and a waveless bay." Through negative visualization, Aurelius aimed to instill in himself the virtue of accepting life's inevitable changes with equanimity, rather than anxiety or despair when confronted with loss. Another Stoic meditation technique Aurelius advocated was the practice of nightly self-reflection and review of one's thoughts, intentions, and actions over the past day. He would ask himself probing questions like, "What wrong or irrational thing have I seen in this day? What use have I made of my rational faculty? How have I failed in following the path of nature and the divine purpose?" This daily soul-searching and accounting of one's character was meant to reinforce commitment to Stoic ethical principles and identify areas for continued moral and spiritual development. Perhaps most profound, however, was Aurelius's prescription for adopting what he called the cosmic perspective, visualizing the self not as an isolated individual but as part of an interconnected, rationally ordered universe governed by natural laws. Aurelius would meditate on images like the infinity of the succession of human and divine revolutions, the petty corners of the earth in which thou hidest thyself, and thou growest burdensome to thyself. By taking this expansive, impersonal view of the human condition as but one small part of a vast, ever-transforming totality of existence, Aurelius hoped to transcend his own personal worries and tribulations. The goal was to attain the Stoic ideal of apatheia, a state of freedom from irrational desires and troubling passions, through the exercise of reasoned objectivity and acceptance of one's place within the greater order of nature. In addition to these three core techniques, Aurelius also advocated continuously analyzing and dissecting one's perceptions, judgments, and opinions about external events to avoid becoming a puppet jerked around by erroneous assumptions. As he wrote, "If thou art pained by external things, it is not they that disturb thee, but thine own judgment about them. And it is in thy power to wipe out that judgment now." For the Stoic practitioner like Aurelius, true peace of mind comes not from changing one's circumstances, but from changing one's judgments and interior dialogue about those circumstances. Stoic meditation, in essence, trains the philosopher to rationally scrutinize non-virtuous reactions before consenting to them. Throughout the Meditations, Aurelius returns again and again to these contemplative practices, self-exhorting statements, and philosophical exercises as a means of mental and spiritual fortification in the face of immense challenges, both public and personal. Even as he led military campaigns, navigated civic crises, and eventually saw his son die before him, Aurelius found strength and solace through Stoic meditation and its rational reframing of obstacles as mere natural occurrences to be met with virtuous acceptance and resilience. "The universe is change," he reminded himself. "Our life is what our thoughts make it." So while the external context of Aurelius's world was drastically different from our own modern era, the philosopher king's inner battles with anger, doubt, grief, and the struggle to find life's greater meaning remain universally and timelessly resonant experiences. His Meditations and the Stoic philosophical framework from which they arose provide a treasury of wisdom and inspiration for anyone today wishing to cultivate greater self-mastery, fortitude, and clarity of mind amidst life's inevitable storms. Across the centuries and cultures, the writings of this powerful yet humble Roman emperor have found a wide and diverse echo among thinkers, artists, leaders, and strivers of all kinds. Their depth, simplicity, and earnestness speak directly to the human yearning to live an existence of purpose, virtue, and resilient acceptance. As we've explored in this introduction, Marcus Aurelius turned to his Stoic meditation practices not just as a philosophical exercise, but as a means of fortifying his very humanity. The life and philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was born in 121 AD to an aristocratic family in ancient Rome. From a very young age, he enjoyed an extraordinarily privileged upbringing full of wealth, status, and opportunity. As the son of an elite political dynasty, Marcus was raised in the imperial palace and groomed for power and leadership. However, despite his opulent surroundings, Marcus showed little interest in the typical pursuits of the wealthy and powerful Roman elite, like accumulating riches, throwing lavish parties, or indulging in sensual pleasures. Instead, this naturally bright and inquisitive young man was drawn to the principles of philosophy, especially the teachings of the ancient Stoics. The philosophy of Stoicism emerged from ancient Greece in the 3rd century BC. It was founded by the philosopher Zeno of Citium and later became one of the most influential schools of thought in the ancient world, alongside Platonism, Aristotelianism, and Epicureanism. At its core, Stoicism taught that the path to lasting happiness and well-being came through living an ethical life based on virtue, reason, and acceptance of things outside one's control. The Stoics believed that many of life's troubles stem not from external events, but from our own irrational judgments, emotions, and attachments that cause us to respond poorly. According to Stoic doctrine, by focusing solely on that which is within our individual power, our own judgments, intentions, and actions, we can achieve a state of tranquility, freedom from disturbing emotions, and alignment with the rational divine laws of nature and the universe. The 4 cardinal virtues the Stoics prescribed were wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. From an early age, the impressionable young Marcus Aurelius was instilled with these Stoic principles and ethical ideals by a number of highly respected tutors and philosophers. He took to heart the doctrine of leading a modest, sober life path, remaining detached from excessive external desires, and single-mindedly cultivating one's own reason, self-control, and sense of duty. So while his contemporaries chased after the typical vices and indulgences of the aristocracy, Marcus Aurelius stood out for his personal austerity, seriousness of mind, and dedication to living according to the Stoic virtues. His classical biographers praised his shunning of lavish excess and devotion to the studious life of philosophy. This personal predilection towards philosophical wisdom and ethical introspection would serve Marcus well when, at the age of 40 in 161 AD, he unexpectedly inherited full power and became Emperor of Rome, one of the ancient world's most daunting leadership roles. For nearly 2 decades, from 161 to 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius held supreme authority over an empire that stretched across most of what was then the known world, spanning regions across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. As emperor, he was tasked with making weighty decisions that would impact the lives of millions and the trajectory of human civilization itself. And Marcus's reign was anything but a peaceful or easy one. He faced a succession of major crises that continually tested his leadership abilities, moral fortitude, and adherence to his Stoic principles. These included protracted military campaigns attempting to defend the empire's frontiers from invading Germanic tribes. At one point, Marcus spent 8 years living in Spartan conditions on the battlefields alongside his troops. A devastating pandemic known as the Antonine Plague, which may have killed up to 5 million people, around 30% of the empire's population at the time. Political uprisings, coups, and assassination plots, including an attempted overthrow by his closest military advisor and insurrections by other factions. It was amidst this chaotic high-stakes backdrop that Marcus Aurelius relied heavily on the philosophical wisdom and meditation practices of his beloved Stoicism to remain centered, retain perspective, and lead with nobility and virtue. Marcus channeled his philosophical reflections and private musings into a work titled Meditations, a series of spiritual exercises and self-exhortations meant to reinforce his own commitment to living according to Stoic ethics and reason. It's important to note that the meditations were never intended for public readership. Marcus Aurelius wrote these journal entries solely for his own private counsel and inner exploration as a way to imbue himself with Stoic values and sustain his sense of duty, morality, and calm perseverance amidst turbulent times. Yet it is this very quality as an unvarnished self-portrait from the pen of Marcus Aurelius himself, free from any artifice or agenda besides being an instrument for personal betterment, that gives the meditations such authenticity, relatability, and philosophical resonance even today. Through these intimate writings, we gain an unprecedented window into the internal struggles, fears, uncertainties, and existential reflections of one of the most powerful rulers in ancient history. Even the mighty emperor was still just a flawed human being like the rest of us, grappling with universal experiences like anger, grief, self-doubt, and finding purpose amidst seemingly random injustice and suffering. Yet Marcus didn't just lament these challenges. He systematically applied the tenets of Stoicism as a comprehensive philosophical framework for maintaining inner equilibrium no matter how dire or chaotic the external circumstances might be. At the heart of Stoic philosophy was the belief that we can only control our own reasoned judgments, intentions, and virtuous actions, not the unfolding events of the world around us. A Stoic practitioner's peace of mind comes from eliminating negative judgments and false perceptions caused by excessive attachment to pleasure or aversion to pain and discomfort. As Marcus Aurelius put it in one of his most famous quotations from the Meditations, "The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it." In other words, a human being can transcend suffering by mastering their inner dialogue and rationally accepting that which they cannot control, including their own mortality. Throughout his seminal writings, Marcus provides a rich first-hand account of how he personally applied Stoic meditation techniques and philosophical exercises to cultivate this kind of elevated perspective and magnanimous forbearance. He describes practices like negative visualization, where one vividly contemplates losing what one is overly attached to in order to gain freedom and appreciate the present moment. He also advocates analyzing one's judgments and sense perceptions with ruthless objectivity to disarm them of toxic emotional charges before they take root. And perhaps most centrally, he urges zooming out to view oneself not as an isolated individual, but as an insignificant speck within the grand, rationally unfolding cosmic order of the natural universe. It was through disciplined application of these introspective, contemplative practices, drawn from ancient Stoicism, that the powerful emperor, Marcus Aurelius, fortified his ability to lead with virtue, resilience, and level-headed pragmatism, even in the face of plagues, battlefield losses, and existential threats to his reign. His words have reverberated across millennia precisely because they don't come from some lofty, unattainable pedestal of philosophizing, but from the humble, relatable heart and soul of a human being determined to seek wisdom and self-mastery while shouldering the greatest of mortal burdens. When we study the life and philosophical reflections of Marcus Aurelius, we encounter a rare historical figure who managed to maintain an unwavering perspective and consistently embody his own highest ideals of character and virtue through both periods of relative peace and civic stability, as well as eras of extreme tumult, hardship, and personal tragedy. Despite the immense privileges and luxuries that came with his aristocratic upbringing and reign as the most powerful leader of the ancient Roman world, Marcus was no sheltered elitist philosophizing merely in theory about Stoic ethics and interior self-mastery. On the contrary, his rule as emperor from 161–180 CE was fraught with escalating cycles of military conflict, civil unrest, cataclysmic plagues, and even assassination plots that directly threatened his life. It was amidst this crucible of momentous real-world pressures and civilizational upheavals that Marcus leaned most heavily on the contemplative practices, ethical guideposts, and philosophical resilience core to ancient Stoic thought. Where lesser rulers may have lapsed into paranoia, Machiavellian cruelty, or endless bouts of anxiety and despair, Marcus Aurelius's supremely cultivated inner equanimity allowed him to respond to each existential threat and setback with extraordinary valor, pragmatic leadership, and a profound sense of cosmically centered nobility. From the battlefields of the Balkans, where he personally led military campaigns for nearly a decade, to the devastating Antonine Plague back home that claimed over 5 million Roman lives, including members of his own family, Marcus demonstrated in his actions and Stoic resolve the embodiment of the philosophical virtues he privately journaled about: prudence, justice, courage in the face of adversity, and a radically humble acceptance of the capriciously unfolding nature of reality itself. Perhaps most profoundly, Marcus's introspective writings and the Meditations reflect his principled determination to continually view himself and the human drama surrounding him, not from the typical fame-oriented lens of self-aggrandizement, but instead through an utterly impersonal cosmic view from above. No matter how lofty his status or how catastrophic the events battering his imperial reign, Marcus disciplined himself to reckon with the radical truth that even the mightiest of human rulers and heroes were but infinitesimally small, transient occurrences within the unfathomably vast frame of whole, universal existence across all space and all time. From this highest celestial vantage point, the ongoing cycles of collapse, rebirth, triumph, and tragedy woven into the fabric of Imperial Rome's narrative appeared more akin to a fleeting, insignificant apparition on the surface of reality rather than its defining essence or prime mover. And by extension, Marcus's identity and life purpose could not become overly invested in or attached to any singular outcome emerging from this cosmic unfolding. His role as a civic leader had to remain rooted in something far more expansive and enduring than any temporal title or success. It was precisely this radical philosophical composure and inner freedom that allowed Marcus Aurelius to exemplify the transcendent promise of Stoic practice in generating a truly imperturbable serenity of being. Here was a man who had quite literally seen and endured some of the most immense possible heights and depths the human experience has to offer. From the lavish luxuries and godlike powers of sitting upon the Roman imperial throne, to the bloody horrors of battlefields and plagues that killed millions on his watch. Yet through it all, Marcus stood unwavering in his dedication to embodying the ethical ideals of wisdom, fortitude, justice, and uncorrupted character he had devoted his life to studying and internalizing. In surveying the arc of Marcus Aurelius's life and tumultuous reign as Roman emperor, what emerges is a rare portrait of an individual human being who managed to encounter the uncompromising realities of the human condition in all their staggering extremes. From the dizzying heights of supreme power and material abundance to the crushing depths of plagues, wars, personal losses, and ever-present threats of death and political violence. Yet through it all, Marcus demonstrated an uncanny capacity to respond to each experience, no matter how utopian or cataclysmic, not from the typical human conditioning of egoic reactivity, mortal terror, or lust for domination and control. Rather, his words and actions modeled a stance of responsiveness emanating from an unshakable foundation of philosophical principle, supreme ethical virtue, and the imperturbable freedom that arises from shedding the delusions of separateness entirely. Here was the most privileged, influential person in the known world of his era, holding supreme executive authority over an empire spanning multiple continents and cultures, with legions awaiting his command and the power to change untold human lives with a mere utterance. Yet as his personal contemplations make strikingly clear, from the cosmic perspective Marcus had disciplined himself to inhabit through years of committed Stoic practice and meditation. No amount of conventional power, fame, or lavish aristocratic trappings could seduce him into mistaking the impermanent constructions of status and self-identity as his ultimate sovereign. With each setback on the battlefield or succession crisis arising to threaten his reign, with each personal tragedy and existential reminder of his own mortality, we witness Marcus continually doubling down on his Stoic commitment to anchor his identity in something far more enduring than the shifting tides of worldly conditions, be they euphoric triumphs fanning the flames of ego, or crushing devastations triggering impulses of reptilian despair, anger, or vengeful lashing out that have brought so many powerful rulers throughout history to ruin. For Marcus, the only bedrock of true sovereignty worth identifying with was the sheer indivisible totality of nature's perfect unfurling, perpetually choreographing the eternal interplay of all apparent forms and phenomena, arising and dissipating back into an ocean of creative interdependence. To eternally situate oneself as a microcosmic current within this vast, impersonal display of cosmic patterning, devoid of story or subjective character, became Marcus's grandest meditation and guiding light amidst the endless upheavals and petty human theatrics playing out in the foreground. In this way, his reign came to model the inspiring possibility of an individual human being rising to meet the comprehensive realities of our species' fraught existential predicament head-on, but from a place of interior unflappability. Neither wealth nor grinding poverty, neither supreme conventional dominion nor complete loss of civic identity and privation, could ultimately unseat Marcus's serene commitment to embodying virtue, calm presence, and unshakable principle in each and every arising moment. Whether patiently commanding legendary military engagements as commander-in-chief or peacefully retreating to his study to journal further philosophical insights, the essence of who Marcus Aurelius fundamentally identified as never wavered or fell prey to the myriad temptations toward ego inflation, nihilism, or resignation that have brought humanity's great civilizations to demise throughout history over and over again. This solemn fidelity to an ethos transcendent of external circumstances and temporal subjective identities is precisely what made Marcus' model of resilience so potently inspirational to such a wide array of truth-seekers, leaders, and independent thinkers across both ancient and modern eras. For in his example, we encounter an individual human life and character that met the call to respond to the most daunting challenges our species can face from a stance of virtue, utterly unswayed by the siren calls of fear, anger, grasping for existential certitude, or any of the emotional reactivity and petty egoic concerns that typically undermine even our noblest of long-term intentions and endeavors. In adapting the ancient Stoic toolkit of meditation, systematic self-auditing, perceptual discipline, and metaphysical reframing to achieve such poise under duress and consistency of moral courage, Marcus Aurelius came to epitomize the supreme promise that this philosophical tradition has long aspired toward: the liberation of human consciousness from the trance of separateness, vindictive storylines, and the subtler shackles of identification with the biographical conditionings of any finite, inevitably perishing identity construct. Stoic meditation techniques from the Meditations. At the heart of Marcus Aurelius's private writings lie several distinct meditation practices and contemplative exercises drawn from the ancient Greek philosophy of Stoicism. For the powerful Roman emperor, these were not mere academic exercises, but tools for rigorously training his own mind to remain grounded in wisdom, virtue, and freedom from afflictive thoughts and emotions. No matter how turbulent or fraught with adversity his external circumstances might become, to the Stoics, the root source of most human suffering and psychological disturbance did not actually arise from the events, challenges, or harsh realities we encounter in the world around us. Rather, the cause of our mental anguish stemmed from our own flawed judgments, irrational desires, toxic emotional attachments, and general misperception about the temporary, ever-changing phenomena and conditioned experiences that make up all of lived reality. The Stoics taught that the path to lasting tranquility, inner freedom, and a profound sense of spiritual equanimity could only be achieved by relentlessly training the mind to discern between what lies within our own sphere of control and influence and what resides entirely outside of it in the realm of external unfolding circumstances. By continually practicing to let go of unhealthy cravings for certain outcomes, deep aversions to difficulties or unwanted scenarios, and all forms of clinging attachment to the inherently impermanent aspects of embodied existence, the Stoic philosophers discovered that human beings could achieve a supreme resilience and unshakable peace of mind. It was this visionary promise of mental self-mastery and imperturbable freedom that Marcus Aurelius fully embraced as a guiding light throughout his life and rule as emperor. In his personal journals collected as the Meditations, Marcus provides first-hand accounts and prescriptive outlines for the specific contemplative practices he utilized to embed these lofty Stoic ideals into the very fabric of his being. Let's take a closer look at 4 of the most impactful and insightful Stoic meditation techniques described by Marcus. Negative visualization. One of the most powerful and transformative mindfulness exercises that Marcus Aurelius explored and advocated was the Stoic technique of negative visualization. At first glance, this practice may seem paradoxical or even morbid, but it was considered a supremely impactful tool for mental and spiritual training by the philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome. The core of negative visualization involves purposefully and vividly contemplating losing, being deprived of, or becoming separated from those particular people, possessions, abilities, or circumstances that we have become most attached to and dependent upon as sources of happiness or security. For Marcus Aurelius himself, still from a position of immense earthly power and material privilege as the Roman emperor, this may have involved him consciously imagining or spiritually rehearsing scenarios where he lost his status, his lavish imperial trappings, his physical health and vitality, or even directly meditating on the inevitability of his own mortality and having this brief flicker of existence extinguished. As he wrote of the practice in his typically understated yet profound style, consider that everything is opinion and perspective, our own mental projections overlaid upon the true nature of reality. Detach from your current judgments and points of view whenever you are able, like a captain shifting the set of his sails, and you'll find safe passage into unexpectedly deep and still waters of being. On the surface, purposefully dwelling on such bleak scenarios as the deprivation of whatever we subjectively most value and cling to may seem like a masochistic or morbid mental exercise. Yet the underlying purpose and effects of negative visualization ended up being paradoxically life-affirming and liberating. By repeatedly turning his consciousness to vividly confront the imagined or inevitable loss of his status, relationships, possessions, and even physical existence itself. Marcus Aurelius aimed to shed himself of the pervasive human cravings, fears, and delusions that cause so much of our psychological turmoil and existential angst. Like his other Stoic meditation practices, negative visualization served as an endurance training for presence, perspective, simplicity, and acceptance of the ultimate impermanence that textures the entire field of lived reality. Whatever sources of pleasure, pride, or identity investment we may have accrued and become attached to in the momentum of living, we are perennially just a few changed circumstances away from those very same conditions, dramatically shape-shifting or disappearing completely. Marcus worked to fully metabolize the profound gratitude, humility, and freedom available in embracing this perpetually unfolding uncertainty and flux as the true nature of the human experience. By continually reminding himself that everything he subjectively categorized as mine, or as constituting the pillars of his very identity, were all non-permanent appearances in constant metamorphosis, he could progressively untether his sense of self and well-being from these fleeting forms. Instead of naively clinging to his remarkably privileged status and opulent quality of life as ultimate indicators of security and fulfillment, Marcus aimed to encounter every pleasure, every experience of abundance or delight as a supremely impermanent gift, perhaps already in a process of dissolution from the first ephemeral nanosecond of its emergence. In maintaining this radically humble, non-attached perspective through regular negative visualization, Marcus Aurelius worked to immunize his inner peace and stability from being held hostage by constantly reactive patterns of desire and aversion. He disciplined himself to release his reflexive impulse to grasp at or push away the ceaseless arising and passing away of conditions, learning to inhabit a state of gracious appreciation for each moment's content exactly as it appeared. Furthermore, negative visualization provided Marcus with a uniquely attuned sensitivity toward the inherent fragility and novelty of his very existence itself. By repeatedly contemplating his own inevitable mortality, he aimed to encounter each opportunity for conscious experience and presence as something stunningly rare, improbable, and sacred, rather than as yet another tedious and unremarkable moment to simply autopilot through. When viewed with this uncompromising lens of radical impermanence and scarcity of subjective being, the ordinary shifts into the extraordinary, with each breath, sight, sound, and felt experience arising as something precious, unbearably poignant, and worthy of being fully metabolized, rather than frittered away in distraction, rumination, or the trance of unconscious habit patterning. Nightly self-reflection. Another foundational meditation practice that Marcus Aurelius leaned on heavily was the systematic ritual of nightly self-reflection and rigorous ethical self-examination. Before retiring each night, the powerful Roman emperor would take time to pause in solitude and run an honest, probing inventory on his thoughts, motivations, words, and deeds over the course of that day. It was during these still moments of inward reckoning that Marcus would put his own character, judgments, and actions under a figurative microscope, testing them against the highest ideals of reason, justice, and virtuous conduct as prescribed by his philosophical lodestars in Stoicism. As he wrote, Marcus would ask himself a series of piercing questions intended to shed an uncompromising light on areas where he may have fallen short of embodying the ethical precepts he knew to be right. What irrational fears or insecurities took hold of my mind today? How well did I truly put my powers of reason into practice when facing life's inevitable frustrations? In what pivotal moments did I fail to remain steadfast on the path of wisdom and virtue? This practice of routine self-auditing served several critical purposes for Marcus Aurelius. By vividly recounting and consciously reckoning with his psychological lapses, distorted judgments, and outright moral failings over the preceding day, he could gain a clear-eyed recognition of the specific areas most in need of increased vigilance, refined philosophical understanding, and expanded self-mastery. Too often, we as human beings are inclined to indulge in various forms of denial, self-deception, and spiritual bypass when faced with our inevitable ethical shortcomings. We rationalize, minimize, or simply distract ourselves from having to confront with any real transparency the ways we chronically fall short of living up to our own stated values and aspirations. For Marcus Aurelius, however, this nightly self-reflection provided an invaluable mirror, shining an honest light on the precise gaps between his intentions and actions, between his most deeply held convictions about how to live an ethical, meaningful life, and the myriad ways he lapsed into compulsive reactivity, needless fear, grasping for validation, or any number of other manifestations of the unintegrated human ego. Yet this penetrating self-inventory was not about punishing himself or descending into unproductive self-loathing and rumination. Far from it. The purpose was to gain an ever-expanding field of insight into the invisible mechanics of his own mind, the habitual illusions and reactive impulses that tended to arise unbidden throughout any given day. With this clear-eyed recognition of where his work remained, Marcus could then renew his philosophical training with redoubled discipline and dedication each new day. He could work to catch the sprouting psychological seeds of unhealthy attachment, aversion, or deluded perception earlier and earlier in their life cycle before they fully took root and blossomed into full-fledged ethical breaches. In many ways, Marcus likened his approach to that of a physician carefully diagnosing the symptoms and underlying causes of an ailment in order to properly treat it. Yet in this case, the disease he tended to was the universal human affliction of the unintegrated psyche, the ceaseless mental discord between our aspirations and our subconscious behavioral patterning, between our values and our often impulsive, reactive experiences of reality. For Marcus, this practice was fundamentally an expression of the core Stoic virtue of pursuing a life of reason, wisdom, and integrity. By routinely auditing himself in this rigorous way, he aimed to shed light into the shadows of his own ignorance and lack of self-mastery, to continually expand the domain of his rational, cultivated consciousness over the instinctive, fearful forces of the human animal, forever tugging him toward unconscious actions. Beyond simply providing a diagnostic function, Marcus's nightly self-reflection ritual also constituted a form of meditative reconsolidation and recommitment to his highest governing ethical principles as a Stoic practitioner. Rather than waking each new morning having left the residues of the previous day's psychological stumbles and moral lapses unexamined and unintegrated, Marcus took intentional time to compassionately reckon with where he fell short, accept those moments of human frailty, and firmly reinscribe his intention and dedication to the path of reason, justice, courage, and equanimity in the face of life's vagaries. In a sense, his nightly self-examination practice was a form of restorative ritual bathing, one where he could recursively shed and purify his psyche of any accrued toxic, the cosmic perspective. One of the most powerful and transformative meditation practices Marcus Aurelius explored was the Stoic ideal of striving to transcend one's typical, limited point of view to embody what he called the cosmic perspective. From this elevated vantage point, Marcus aimed to dissolve his habitual self-absorption and mental fixation on the small-scale trivialities, frustrations, and pleasures that tend to dominate our everyday awareness and priorities as human beings. Instead, he worked to shift his consciousness to witness his own temporary existence from the highest, most panoramic of perspectives, identifying not with the fragile, transient ego personality but as an infinitely small, fleeting observer within the unimaginably vast unfurling of the entire universe throughout eternity. As Marcus would mentally exhort himself to visualize during these awe-inspiring cosmic meditations, look at the stars' paths crisscrossing above as if you detached yourself from this brief existence and relocated as an eternal citizen of the cosmos itself, observing our tiny realm of human affairs from that supreme and all-encompassing vantage point. See the enormous void and eternities of existence stretching boundlessly in all directions beside the single, vanishing human life playing out its short drama here. This radical reorientation of his subjective point of view from the limited, mortal individual's vantage point to the timeless, impartial unfolding of the entire cosmos across eons was no idle mental exercise for Marcus Aurelius. Rather, it constituted a profoundly transformative philosophical and spiritual practice, one intended to completely reframe his experience of life, suffering, ethics, and the nature of human identity itself. From the finite ego's typical perspective of being the protagonist or central fixation point in one's unfolding experiences and struggles, Marcus aimed to transcend that ubiquitous illusion of centrality. Instead of perceiving himself as a uniquely special, substantial self, navigating an almost infinite array of surrounding objects, events, and innumerable other subsidiary personas, Marcus worked to experience reality from precisely the inverse perspective. He was the rare cosmic visitor capable of achieving this reversal, witnessing his small role not as a central character in the human drama, but as just one of trillions upon trillions of equally insignificant subplots within the inconceivable vastness of all creation, emerging and dissolving in perfect harmony with the unfolding of nature. From this ultra-zoomed-out vantage point, the particular circumstances and concerns dominating the everyday waking consciousness of the human psyche were cast in an entirely new light. Their gravity diminished and made to seem almost silly next to the staggering scale of deep space and deep time. Petty grievances, nagging anxieties over status or insecurities, cravings for possessions or pleasures of the moment, these obsessive flurries of mental discord that generate so much of our suffering in daily life would have appeared as little more than mirages or entertaining parlor performances, once glimpsed with the gaze of the pure, infinite cosmos itself. For Marcus Aurelius, meditation on the cosmic perspective was not some esoteric intellectual exercise, but a vehicle for achieving the profound freedom and inner peace of transcending the ego's perpetually fearful, grasping operating system. By repeatedly returning his awareness to this most expansive frame of reference, he learned to encounter each lived moment not from the doomed vantage point of a centrally important independent me, clinging for dear life to finite objects and experiences. Rather, Marcus was able to meet the present as it spontaneously arose with the gracious humility and radical acceptance, due to an expression of impersonal nature unspooling according to her own eternal choreography. From this lofty vantage, the often shocking and brutal realities of human life that struck terror and despair into the hearts of many, poverty, disease, violence, loss of loved ones, and our inevitable march toward physical death itself, would have appeared not as haphazard or unjust attacks, but rather as impersonal features and necessary processes baked into the very fabric of cosmic creation. This radical expansion of perspective to perceive oneself not as a separate, central protagonist in reality's unfolding narratives, but rather as an impermanent, impersonal expression, briefly arising within the choreography of an unfathomably vast totality. This was the visionary lens through which Marcus Aurelius was able to encounter even the most horrific of human experiences and sufferings without collapsing into the crippling spiral of emotional reactivity, overwhelming fear, or the deeply ingrained victim mentality so pervasive among our species. By identifying not with the transient contents of his finite personal existence and subjectively filtered perceptions, but instead with the impartial, eternally metamorphosing totality of nature's patterns themselves, Marcus afforded himself a transcendent equanimity in the face of seeming chaos, injustice, and all manner of circumstances that would break lesser human psyches trapped within the prison of egoic self-absorption. Imagine the tremendous psychological freedom and resilience available to one who has genuinely metabolized the understanding that the subjective self-structure animated by all its constructed identities, manufactured stories, petty fears, and driving ambitions is ultimately no more or less real than the spontaneous arising of heat waves over hot desert sands, or the nebulized clouds of cosmic dust whirling through interstellar space. From this most expansive vantage point that Marcus actualized through years of disciplined meditative practice, all personal trials, achievements, and jarring encounters with mortality itself become recontextualized as inevitable fluctuations within an infinitely patient cosmic dream dance forever unfolding in perfect harmony. Its tune composed of the sublime orchestration of stars being born and dying, civilizations rising and collapsing into dust as if mirages, and the incomprehensible vastnesses of deep time encompassing all transient forms of matter and identity, sparking into temporary incarnations. In realizing his ultimate nature as an expression of this boundlessly creative matrix, rather than taking himself to be merely a separate biographical fragment buffeted about by capriciously uncontrollable forces, Marcus Aurelius was able to encounter the heights and depths of his own imperial reign and dramatic life circumstances with the same essential even-keeledness, impartiality, and distinct lack of preferential clinging intrinsic to the natural world's own indiscriminate self-choreography. Rather than bitterly internalizing the unfathomable plagues, military losses, political backstabbings, and karmic vicissitudes that bombarded his rule, Marcus remained anchored in an abiding poise and inner composure precisely because he no longer fundamentally identified the illusory personal self-construct of his ego mind as reality's prime mover or central character at all. His identity had become inseparable from the impersonal cosmic totality, a limitless, eternally unfolding matrix indifferent to the manufactured narratives of any singular finite life form. From the station of this expansive view from above, No misfortune could ultimately diminish Marcus, or leave him feeling victimized by existence's unspooling dances. As he so eloquently reflected in his meditations, even the most seemingly apocalyptic human calamities were mere insignificant ripples subsumed within the greater symphony of an indivisible nature perpetually orchestrating the eternal interplay of arising and dissolution across all apparent forms and momentary identities. If Marcus's dedication to Stoic discipline and contemplative insight allowed him such profound imperturbability and gracious perspective, even under the most harrowing existential pressures, we can scarcely fathom the transformative potential this cosmic view might bestow if embraced as a standard operating system across the restless, anxiety-fueled operating matrices of our modern societies. To be freed from the myopic hypnosis of self-cherishing and victimhood would be to encounter each arising experience with the humble appreciation and impartial curiosity of a true explorer, empowered to act from our highest values while remaining unshackled from the endless storylines of perpetual winning and losing that drive so much of humanity's self-created suffering. Modern relevance and impact. While Marcus Aurelius lived and wrote his philosophical reflections nearly 2,000 years ago during the ancient Roman era, his teachings on meditation drawn from Stoic philosophy have proven to be strikingly relevant and influential across cultures and eras. In many ways, the humble personal musings of this philosopher king speak directly to the persistent struggles, anxieties, and pursuit of meaning that make up the human condition in any age. His wisdom has reverberated and found new adherents in every subsequent generation, from Enlightenment thinkers and America's founding fathers to modern psychologists, business leaders, and even celebrities. Perhaps most profoundly, the meditation practices advocated by Marcus Aurelius presaged the contemporary mindfulness movement that has become a cultural phenomenon and subject of intensive scientific study in recent decades. At their core, several of Marcus's introspective techniques aimed at cultivating a paradoxically transcendent, yet anchored mental perspective, closely align with the goals and impacts of modern secular mindfulness. The quintessential instance is Marcus's advocacy for the Stoic exercise of negative visualization, the purposeful contemplation of losing those things we feel most attached to, whether material possessions, relationships, or our very existence itself. While this practice may seem paradoxical or even morbid on its surface, the intent was to instill a profound sense of gratitude, acceptance, and presence in the meditator. By stripping away cravings and aversions to the inevitable changes and losses that characterize the human experience, negative visualization allows the practitioner to encounter each moment with awake, unflinching acceptance rather than becoming mired in anxieties and dissatisfactions rooted in the temporal and mutable. This cultivation of a grounded, non-judgmental awareness of the perpetual unfolding of the present moment lies at the heart of modern mindfulness as well. Instead of avoiding or resisting difficulty, discomfort, or deprivation through aversion, we learn to simply allow all thoughts, feelings, and experiences to arise and pass away without clinging to them as inadequate or needing to be other than what they are. Remarkably, neuroscientific research has confirmed the positive impacts of this radically accepting yet calmly aware state of mind on psychological well-being. Brain imaging studies have shown that mindfulness practices can functionally rewire neurological pathways, strengthening traits like cognitive control, while tamping down reactivity in the brain's fear and emotional centers. Marcus's prescribed technique of routinely auditing one's judgments, perceptions, and thought patterns through nightly self-reflection also closely mirrors the insights of modern cognitive behavioral therapy. By rigorously analyzing the often distorted stories and impressions our minds generate about external events, we disarm them of their toxic emotional charges and regain a sense of rational perspective. For the ancient Stoics and Marcus Aurelius himself, unfiltered clinging to irrational fears, cravings, and judgments was understood as the root cause of most human suffering and troubles. Mindfulness and cognitive self-monitoring allow us to uproot those deeply ingrained conditioning and free ourselves from being jerked around by our own runaway thoughts. Beyond these therapeutic parallels, Marcus's philosophical reflections continue to influence movements like modern Stoicism and existentialism in tackling questions of human meaning, morality, and our relationship to the vast cosmos. His recurrent theme of taking an expansive, non-anthropocentric view from above situates humankind's existence and self-absorption within a far grander dance of impersonal, universal cycles and natural laws. Contemplating our brief, infinitesimal role within this unfurling of deep time was prescribed as an antidote to the obsessive self-involvement that fuels so much of our psychological unrest. In this sense, Marcus advocated transcending the ego to identify with something greater than our finite individual selves, a theme that aligns with modern secularized articulations of spiritual enlightenment as the shedding of false attachments to a separate, permanent identity. For Marcus, this cosmic perspective translated into a supreme ethical injunction to live with steadfast virtue and noble character regardless of the impermanent conditions constantly swirling around us. If joy and adversity are both temporary, fleeting experiences within an incomprehensibly vast field of existence, the only path to enduring fulfillment is to fearlessly embody our highest values of wisdom, justice, and rational self-governance in every moment. This notion of human beings as alone responsible for authoring ethical meaning in an inherently meaningless universe echoes core tenets of modern existentialist thought, yet Marcus's resilient, duty-bound worldview provides an uplifting counterpoint to the despair and alienation associated with existentialism. His Stoic acceptance and inner freedom when confronted with mortality, privation, or injustice continues to inspire people across cultures in finding equanimity and courage amid the inherent difficulties of what he called the hostile coursings of the universe. From Enlightenment thinkers like René Descartes and Pierre Gassendi to literary giants like Matthew Arnold and John Steinbeck, countless philosophers, artists, and intellectuals have adopted Marcus Aurelius as a guiding light. George Long's English translation of the Meditations found an ardent admirer in William Wordsworth, who bequeathed it with the inscription, "A wise and virtuous man's self-communion, the best of books." Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote of first reading Marcus's famously luminous words, "It was mind mingling itself with mind, de-honoring itself." Modern psychologists from Pierre Hadot to Donald Robertson have studied Marcus's writings as a template for cultivating resilience and well-being through Stoic philosophical practices. But Marcus's wisdom is by no means the private reserve of academic, artistic, or spiritual circles alone. Many luminaries of business, sports, and politics continue to find inspiration and practical value in the Stoic emperor's insights. Microsoft founder Bill Gates has called Marcus Aurelius the best book I've read for its timeless wisdom and sage perspective. Former U.S. President Bill Clinton and Oprah Winfrey have cited the Meditations as deeply influential readings. Self-help authors and business coaches draw upon the Stoic principles of rational self-mastery, steadfast virtue, mindfulness, and taking a cosmic perspective to train exceptional leaders and teams across fields. From Silicon Valley tech moguls like Intel's Andrew Grove to scholars, artists, and U.S. military leaders, the transcendent yet pragmatic sagacity of Marcus Aurelius continues to light the way. While the outward circumstances of our modern era may be dramatically different from the ancient world he inhabited, the fundamental existential questions and human struggles Marcus Aurelius grappled with have not changed. His personal writings from 2 millennia ago resonate across the centuries because they speak with humble candor about our most timeless longings, to find inner peace, to rise above petty preoccupations and needless suffering, to live an authentic life of purpose and virtue regardless of external limitations or adversities. In many ways, the contemplative practices and philosophical exhortations that Marcus Aurelius prescribed for himself from the lofty seat of the ancient Roman Empire seem to carry an unexpectedly urgent message for our own frenetically paced, anxiety-ridden, and chronically distracted modern age. At a time when many of us find ourselves overwhelmed by inner and outer conditions, whirling more rapidly than perhaps ever before in human history, Marcus's steadfast call to cultivate awareness beyond the confines of narrow self-absorption takes on the resonance of an indispensable prophetic wisdom for the 21st century and beyond. Whether it's the Sisyphean struggle to resist the dopamine-driven trance of omnipresent digital distraction, the mounting collective strain of climate disruption and ecological uncertainty, compounding socio-political upheavals, and the perpetual current of violence, trauma, and human rights abuses flooding our daily news feeds, Marcus's clarion reminders about the critical importance of transcending petty personal preoccupations by situating our identities within a vast cosmic framework become powerfully apropos in ways he could scarcely have foreseen. Like a skillful spiritual teacher, Marcus instructs us to pause and recalibrate our consciousness outside the relentless stream of external noise and sensationalism, viewing from above our small, ultimately ephemeral roles in apocalyptic storylines as if through the impartial, supernarrative lens of a dispassionate awareness spanning all of space and all of time. Only by stretching our minds to consider the whole grand choreography of universal patterning from this widest imaginable perspective, he reassures, can we regain the radical equanimity and freedom required to respond to life's most daunting challenges with resilient wisdom, nobility, and steely grace under pressure. Uncompromising in our mistaken conviction of separateness and self-cherishing as the be-all and end-all of meaning and purpose, we moderns have become all too skilled at getting hypnotized by the endless vortex of personalized dramas, tragedies, and fleeting triumphs constantly populating our subjective experience. Whether via social media news feeds, algorithmically customized to amplify bias and reactivity, or the unceasing narratives of divisive political tribalism and social polarization, our species' core default setting remains fixated on provincially viewing both the biggest and smallest of circumstances through an exclusively self-referential, egocentric frame. No matter how hyper-intelligent, globally connected, or technologically advanced we may become, our fundamental misperception of separation from the wider cosmic matrix, never proceeding. Our individual existences risks anchoring us to the same petty human cycles of grasping and aversion, friend-enemy framing, and fear-driven decision-making that have plagued our civilizational progress for millennia. This pervasive delusion of separateness is precisely the toxic trance from which Marcus awakens us through his personal meditations and therapeutic metaphysics of practicing the cosmic perspective. For only once we have disciplined ourselves to perceive the ultimate insignificance of our day-to-day trials and achievements within an infinitely grander interplay of spontaneous patterning, can we stop treating our own small, phenomenal storyline as the central narrative mattering most, or even mattering at all beyond an illusory conceptual designation. From the unflinching view from above, all appearances and experiences become neutralized as equally impersonal, impermanent occurrences subsumed within the unified choreography of nature herself. Our personal stories of triumph and catastrophe alike become recontextualized as mere shooting stars blinking in and out of ephemeral existence within a cosmic dreamscape, encompassing all apparent dramas and sagas beyond any need to take sides or fuel them with subjective mental proliferations. In awakening to this most ultimate perspective of situated freedom, the cycles of reactivity, outrage, and fleeting satisfaction to which we so often pledge the bulk of our human identities can finally be recognized for what they truly are. Passing LLN reveries that can be met with the grace of equanimous spaciousness rather than grasped after with anxious addictive self-referentiality. This supreme transmutation of perception and radical recontextualization of meaning is not, of course, merely some esoteric theory or lofty mental exercise for Marcus. Throughout his meditations, the philosopher king models how such a cosmically expansive reorientation of identity can translate into resilient nobility and decisiveness under immense real-world pressure and conflict. Conclusion: as we come to the end of this exploration into the life, teachings, and contemplative practices of Marcus Aurelius, it's remarkable to reflect on just how resonant and applicable his insights remain nearly 2,000 years later. The writings collected in his seminal work, Meditations, were not theoretical, philosophical treatises intended for a broad audience. Rather, they represented the Roman emperor's most candid and unguarded daily self-reflections, the private inner workings of a puissant historical figure who just so happened to wield supreme power and influence over the ancient world. Yet it is precisely because of their intimate personal nature that the meditations of Marcus Aurelius have managed to transcend the centuries, to find new relevance and reverence in every subsequent era of human history. For in reading his words we encounter not distant, unattainable doctrine, but rather the humble, relatable struggles of a man doing his utmost to lead a life of profound character, purpose, and virtue. Through Marcus's philosophical journal, we gain an unprecedented window into the interior mental landscape of one of antiquity's most impactful leaders, as he continuously grappled with the same universal challenges that make up the human experience: the fear of mortality, dealing with anger, overcoming anxiety over an uncertain future, finding deep meaning and fulfillment amidst turbulent circumstances. In this light, Marcus does not come across primarily as a legendary emperor, nor even as one of history's most influential Stoic thinkers. He presents himself openly as simply a person striving to be a good human being, working with great effort to embody the ethical qualities of humility, justice, courage, and self-mastery, through the spiritual tradecraft of Stoic meditation. From the most privileged station of supreme power, Marcus remained acutely cognizant of his own flaws, shortcomings, and doubts as a finite, fallible human. This ability to rigorously self-reflect, acknowledging areas in continual need of ethical refinement and growth, is perhaps his greatest lesson to us. True character and nobility does not stem from portraying an idealized perfection, but from the lifelong work of manifesting our highest potentials while owning our inevitable inconsistencies. And it is through the methodical application of ancient Stoic meditative practices that Marcus found the tools for this constant work of recalibration, a means to detach from cravings, aversions, and judgments that generate unneeded suffering, while reorienting himself to alignment with nature's rational, universal order. The techniques he explored, like negative visualization, nightly self-audits, adopting a cosmic perspective, and perceptive reframing, may feel foreign or paradoxical from our modern vantage point. Yet, as we've seen, they provided Marcus with a comprehensively integrated philosophical framework for responding with equanimity and patient fortitude, no matter how daunting the external challenges at hand. From reports of pandemic, civil insurrection, assassination plots, battlefield losses, and the deaths of loved ones, the Stoic spiritual discipline Marcus undertook in his personal meditations offered an ethical and psychological toolkit for rising above reactivity, fear, or paralysis. Through embodying core principles like amor fati, a wholehearted acceptance of one's fate, viewing life's vagaries from the highest vantage of cosmic neutrality, and a radical suspension of unhelpful judgments and false certitudes, Marcus strove to meet all of life's demanding episodes with reason, character, and nobility. In our present era of hyperconnectivity, rapid change, and omnipresent stressors, his exhortations to remain mindful, avoid narrow self-absorption, and embrace life's inevitable struggles as catalyzing agents for personal evolution feel more urgently relevant than ever. The temptation to distract, escapism, and buck responsibility in the face of tension runs stronger than ever before in human history. Yet, as Marcus reminds us, no more wandering. Take control of what you were born to do. We each are called to author our own destiny through the sum of how we respond to the circumstances at hand, not to let reality happen to us by default. By bringing lucid awareness, rational perspective, and an unwavering commitment to virtue into each lived moment, Marcus Aurelius modeled how to alchemize even the most daunting of human experiences into opportunities for ethical clarity, resilience, and transcendent freedom. Rather than collapsing into emotional reactivity, seeking to avoid discomfort at all costs, or indulging the escapist fantasies of victimhood when faced with seemingly unjust adversity, Marcus demonstrated the inspirational possibility of remaining anchored in the unshakable poise and interior sovereignty that arises from shedding all misperceptions of separateness. His personal journals outline a rich philosophical framework, an integrated contemplative toolkit for encountering each arising circumstance, from the most ecstatic to the most horrific, with the same undergirding acceptance, humility, and fundamental lack of preferential agenda intrinsic to the unfurling motion patterns of nature's perpetual creative display itself. To study Marcus Aurelius's life and writings is not merely an academic pursuit, but an intimate tutorial on what it looks like for a human being to fearlessly inhabit the existential uncertainty and radical impermanence that deeply unsettles most of our species' socially conditioned operating systems. Here was an individual who managed to embody the fullest extent of Stoic ideals in the intense cauldron of ruling an empire, deftly steering a course of virtue and selfless leadership while never losing sight of the humble cosmic perspective that allowed him to remain unswayed by the siren calls of ego, conquest, or blind obedience to his own impermanent storyline.